I'm here with Jeff Reichert. He is the writer and director of the new documentary Gerrymandering. Jeff developed release campaigns for a number of excellent documentaries, including No End in Sight and Enron, The Smartest Guys in the Room. So, Jeff, this is such a threat to, well, so-called democracy. What can citizens do about gerrymandering?
Well, there are a lot of different things we can do. In states that have the initiative and referendum process, like California, like Florida, and some others, you can put measures on the ballot to try and constrain the politicians in drawing the lines, or take the politicians out of the line drawing process entirely. Unfortunately, most states don't have that, and so if there is to be any real redistricting reform, it has to go through the legislatures themselves. So politicians will have to vote to give up the power that they have to protect their own jobs. That gets a little tougher. But we have a kind of unprecedented opportunity right now because, in the past few years, the kinds of mapping software that was only available to politicians and consultants is available to everybody. People use Google Maps all the time, and you can draw districts in Google Maps very, very easily. And so, I think the citizenry is more aware of the spaces in which they live and the idea of geography than they have been for a very long time. And so the potential is that you can coordinate movements within given states so that as the legislatures are doing their own line drawing behind closed doors, citizens are drawing their own maps. And so when the legislature produces a plan and says, well, you know what, this is the best plan we could get. Sorry, African Americans, we couldn't give you any representation. A high school student can draw a map and say, no, I got the African Americans the representation they wanted. I mean, I had to knock out a couple of longtime incumbents. Sorry, but if we're going to say that we want to prioritize the rights of minority candidates over these other questions, I drew that map. Or a retired high school teacher or a librarian, people can go and draw their own maps and show the lie that is the legislative redistricting process, which is sort of they produce these plans and they just say, this is the best we got.
In terms of actually changing the system, it seems like Democrats and Republicans, unfortunately, this is a two-party system. It seems to be getting worse in terms of third parties these days. Here in California, no one's even really talking about them for the governor's race. But did you find any differences between the Democrats and the Republicans, or are they happy with the status quo at this point?
Oh, they like the status quo because, they sort of figure, well, if we have the advantage in this state, the other party has the advantage in this state, and so it reaches some sort of parity. Parity isn't what the idea of our democracy is supposed to be about. It's supposed to be about voters being able to express their wills, not parties being able to achieve parity in numbers in the redistricting process. So I think, I think it again comes back to this question of taking the politicians out of it, taking it out of the hands of the parties. Then we can start to reform the redistricting process, and then we can start getting into what I think are some of the more interesting questions. Do we actually need districts? Do we count our votes in the right ways? Are there other ways to count votes and allow people to vote? But I think if we don't get past the redistricting hurdle first, you can't get to more interesting areas of reform. The districting system we have and the electoral systems we have, where you have a geographically defined space, and we elect people so that the person who wins 50% of the plus one of the vote is the winner, and the other 49% of the people can just go, can go sulk for a while. That inherently produces a two-party system. So it's always going to be hard for third-party candidates in the system that we have. So fix redistricting, get that machinery working a little bit better, and then let's start tackling some other ideas and saying, hey, wait, this democracy we've been using for the last 200 and some odd years, it's a little rusty, it's a little stale. Nobody seems to be using this kind of democracy anymore. I mean, most other countries, they've updated it and they try all sorts of different sorts of things. Let's do that here. But I think the roadblock is really getting some sort of fluidity in terms of the incumbency and the candidates that we have.
You took a look at efforts in California. Are you seeing any success stories across the country in terms of good efforts being taken to the voters?
Well, the Arizona instituted a commission after the last round of redistricting, and people seemed pretty happy with how the lines were drawn there. They brought in, they put together a citizens commission, they hired some good consultants, and they all worked together and they produced a plan that, on the balance, some people always complain about any given plan, but the majority of folks seem to think it actually worked out all right. California passed Proposition 11 in 2008, which the commission hasn't had a chance to start yet, and it's already politicians are already trying to scuttle it and saying that it's not working. It wouldn't come into effect until next year. So we'll see. I'm optimistic about the Proposition 11 Commission. I think they've done a really good job of trying to figure out how to take any sort of conflicts of interest out of the process, and how to pick a good pool of candidates to narrow down to that 14. They thought really hard about it, and you could see a better map, assuming that Proposition 27 doesn't pass, which would destroy the whole effort.
How do you make gerrymandering or this issue exciting for people to actually pay the $10 to $12 ticket and sit in a theater for almost 2 hours?
It's a good question. I think a lot of people thought along the way that we wouldn't be able to make it that accessible. We tried everything, and I think we came to the conclusion that you had to boil it down to this really micro level, and so show these crazy stories and these weird pockets of America. You have Dave Arenberg, a state senator from Florida, who has to put on a cowboy hat and go bet on armadillo races because that's the constitution of his district. Or Hakeem Jeffries in Brooklyn, who just, he lived in this district his entire life and was carved out of it by an incumbent. And that's the stuff that people can really find relatable. And then also, once you realize that you have all these possibilities around animation, people love animation, and we had a lot of fun, drawing all different kinds of maps and doing different sorts of things. And, I'd be lying if I said that we didn't use a kind of a heavily energized rock score, to help buoy things and keep things moving along. Because it is dense, but we wanted the movie to feel, we wanted it to be an enjoyable experience. We wanted it to be entertaining. We didn't want it to feel just like you were getting lectured or hectored, and I didn't want people to leave the theater and just feel bad. Because I think a lot of documentaries you leave and you just feel bad and you just feel overwhelmed, like, oh God, what can I do about this?
Right.
And we wanted people to leave the theater feeling like, oh, well, we just witnessed a fundamental change in California politics around redistricting. We saw all these different kinds of stories. We learned about all these different kinds of ways we can change it. So let's go do something about it.
Did you have a hard time selling this documentary?
Selling the
idea and getting the funding?
No, for a couple of years, and part of it was our my own inexperience, because I learned the issue really well and could talk about the issue at length, but for a while it was really hard for me to explain how it would be a movie, because I didn't know until we started shooting how all these different pieces were going to fit into place. And it wasn't even until very late in the process that it all kind of like came together, and we felt, oh, this is now a film as opposed to what we had before, which was just a conglomeration of scenes. And so, yeah, it took us a while to find money. It still is hard for us to convince people that this is something that is necessarily going to be watchable. But for the most part, after people see it, they feel, oh, well, wow, this is far from what I expected it to be. And
it's so great that a documentary like this can still get made in this economy at a time when so many, unfortunately, independent cinemas are shutting down.
Oh, it's hard. It's a bad time for docs. I think there was a doc glut a few years ago, and there were so many documentaries out there that people just kind of shut off because there was a bit of a sameness. There's a kind of a formula around the issue doc, and it's going to work in a certain kind of way, and you're going to see all these things, and at the end you're going to be really depressed about it. We wanted to try and do something a little bit different, but it was hard to sell that up front. And a lot of the things we found in the movie that I think make it different, we found them along the way. The guy who opens the film, the crazy Revolutionary War reenactor who sings the fake song, we just happened to find him in Massachusetts. But I think he sets the tone for the film, because the first thing you see is not something that's very menacing or people talking about this menacing thing. It's a joke. It is a ridiculous farce thing. And I think redistricting to a certain extent politically is farce.
We're speaking with Jeff Reichert, writer and director of the new documentary Gerrymandering. And in part 3, we will talk about the power of documentaries. And this is Jeff's first documentary, so I'll also ask him what advice he has for aspiring documentaries.